Today I'm going to talk about spying, dissimulation and early modern fake news. Yeah, if I just, put that in the corner. In recent years, we've heard quite a lot about this concept, fake news. It's a term that became synonymous with the presidency of the former American president, Donald Trump. And it also came to prominence in Britain during the Brexit referendum and its aftermath, as Leavers and Remainers alike accused each other of peddling lies to get their own way. And these concerns about fake news are a symptom of wider concern, often related to the role of the internet, and more specifically, social media, and the role that these new things are starting to play in political culture. The fact that anyone can spread news quickly and easily online has had a destabilizing effect on political discussion. The WikiLeaks data breaches provided a particularly striking example of how the internet could be used to circumvent traditional barriers of secrecy and national security. And new online news websites allow anyone to share news widely, undermining the structures and hierarchies of traditional news media. Where the media used to be dominated by a smaller number of well-known outlets, staffed by a small class of trained journalists, these days, anyone with a Twitter account can gather a following and spread the news that they want. And this destabilization can be seen as a very positive development, democratizing our political culture and allowing a wider range of people to participate. However, it's also made it easier to spread misinformation. And that's been a cause for concern, as you might imagine. Yes, the internet revolution, therefore, has a good claim to be the most significant historical development of the last 40 years. But for all that, such a rapid change and shift in human communications is not entirely without precedent. So today I thought we'd take a look back at another dramatic information revolution with substantial implications for political culture, the 15th century print revolution. And though the parallels can be overstated, there are important ways in which early modern concerns about the rapid proliferation of print media mirror our concerns about the internet today. While commentators have been quick to suggest that fake news is a very new phenomenon, these worries are not as uniquely modern as we might think. Concerns about misinformation have an early modern history too, and it's that history that we'll be exploring for the rest of this talk. Like the internet, proliferation of the printing press, of printed news, allowed information to be spread quicker than ever. From the very earliest days, it was clear that this could have a darker side, allowing rumours to be spread widely and giving new authority to printed events and printed statements as if they were fact, when in fact they were not. Looking back today, historians have highlighted in particular the case of Simonino of Trent as an early example of misinformation having unfortunate consequences. In this case, Simonino, a 2-year-old boy in Trent, went missing, and the local bishop swiftly blamed the Jews without any confirmatory evidence. And while this sort of blaming the Jews for murders, particularly for the murders of children, is relatively common in the early modern period and before, in this particular instance, the fact that the allegations could be written down meant that they had consequences not just for the Jews in Trent, but across Europe. So 15 Jews were executed as a consequence of these allegations. And the hatred against them was spread in prints across Europe, including this one, which is a German print. And so it managed to reinforce anti-Semitic feeling in a wider range of places than would have been possible in an earlier period. And of course, the fact that it was written down in a lasting way meant that this would continue into the future. So Simonino's case is a gruesome example of a broader phenomenon. The 16th century saw an increasing appetite for news across Europe, and people were very keen to find out all the information they could, and as quickly as they could, meaning that sometimes it was difficult to verify what had really gone on. And in the century of the Reformation, it's unsurprising that religious news and books became particularly popular. And this helped with wider pattern of confessionalization in the period. So there were certain stories that played into the religious tensions following the Reformation, which essentially, to use the modern terminology for it, went viral. So amongst Protestants, this was the news of the Catholic massacre of Protestants in France, known as the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. While for Catholics, the news that the Protestant Queen of England, Elizabeth I, had had her cousin, the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots, executed, was similarly caused shock and was widely spread amongst Catholics. And here we can see a woodcut version of this event, which was one of the ways in which people across Europe came to know about this development. So like today, some contemporary observers lamented what they saw as increasing polarization between confessional groups, while others were eager to take advantage of these developments to gather information and spread their own ideas. So like it or loathe it, the people of 16th and 17th century Europe were fascinated by the development of a culture of news and recognized that it had made fundamental changes to the workings of politics and political culture. I will now talk about a specific example of an early modern news culture, the city of Venice. Venice was a natural centre for the exchange of information. It was one of Europe's great ports, and it witnessed a wide variety of people passing through the city each day. Given this large footfall, it's unsurprising that Venice was one of the important places in Europe, which was instrumental in spreading the Black Death when it first arrived in Europe. As we can see from this chart, the disease spread from Venice to other parts of the continent. And it's also unsurprising that it is from Venice that we get various terms, which we've been hearing a lot of in recent times. For example, the word quarantine, which comes from a Venetian practice of making travellers stay in quarantine for 40 days after their arrival. We, of course, saw something similar to this happen last year. Venice is no longer a great centre of trade, but it is a great centre of tourism. And this fact helps explain why it was one of the places in Europe that suffered one of the first major outbreaks of COVID-19. Venice's status as an important trading centre also made it one of the most cosmopolitan places in early modern Europe. It was a city of many cultures and many races. And we can see this variety in the works of the English playwright William Shakespeare, who set two of his most famous plays in Venice. The Merchant of Venice tells the story of a villainous Jew, Shylock, while the tragic hero Othello is a black Venetian general. Shakespeare's stories are fictitious, but the multi-ethnic society that he portrays was real. Venice had the largest Jewish population in Europe. Jews were forced to live separately in a ghetto, another word which has entered our own language from Venetian, and you can still visit the Jewish ghetto in Venice today, though of course now no Jews are compelled to live there. Venice also had noteworthy African and Arabian influences. Here is a painting by the Venetian painter Vittorio Carpaccio of the Rialto Bridge, the centre of trade in Venice, painted in 1494. At the front here, we can see a black gondolier. And further back, we see some men wearing turbans, probably visitors from the Ottoman Empire. Rather like the globalized world we live in today, Venice was characterized by a constant flow of people, and with the people came new ideas and information from other countries. If you wanted to know news from across Europe and the Middle East, you needed informants in Venice. The development of this Venetian culture of information had implications for both Venetian politics and the wider politics of Europe. For an example of how the Venetian culture of information opened the way for new political activities, we'll now focus on one particular figure who took advantage of these opportunities, the English ambassador to Venice, Sir Henry Wotton. Wotton was sent to Venice in 1604 to represent the interests of James VI and I, King of Scotland and England. The English saw Venice as a natural ally. Both states were significant trading powers who were suspicious of the powers of Spain, their largest competitor. England was Protestant, having broken with the Pope during Henry VIII's reign. Meanwhile, Venice was still Catholic. In 1606, however, Venice got into an acrimonious dispute with the Pope, known as the Venetian Interdict controversy, a dispute about ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Wotton and King James hoped that in the wake of this dispute, Venice might be convinced to convert to Protestantism. As a Protestant ambassador in a Catholic country, Wotton was allowed by the Venetian authorities, the Senate and Doge, to bring his own chaplain to give services in his ambassadorial chapel. These services were meant to be for the ambassador and his household alone, but the Pope's representative in Venice was soon complaining to the Venetian government that Wotton was also inviting Venetians along in an attempt to convert them. As we know, Wotton was in fact hoping to do just that. To try and prevent corruption, the Venetian Senate had laws against its public officials meeting with foreign diplomats in a private setting. But Wotton used a variety of means to get around these rules. One of the methods he used was to meet Venetians who were sympathetic to Protestantism in shops. Shops became centres for meeting and exchanging news in Venice. So here we see this wider culture of news creating opportunities for political interactions that might otherwise not have been able to happen. And all sorts of shops were involved. Often it was bookshops, stationers, people who exchanged political information for a living. But also important were shops like apothecaries. And often people who were apothecaries or barbers, people like that, they became important figures as mediators of news, passing it on to interested citizens in Venice and foreign visitors who wanted to have somewhere they could come to exchange information. So everyone could claim a good reason to be in these places, so it made it impossible to police whether these meetings were legitimate or not. And Wotton, as well as using shops, also arranged covert meetings in other places that it was legitimate for people to visit for non-political reasons, in particular churches, which he visited under the pretext of admiring the paintings or listening to the music. And this is the Basilica of Santi Giovanni a Paolo in Venice, where Wotton met a particular Jesuit who he wanted to meet, a Jesuit. They were part of a religious order who particularly closely linked to the Pope. So this was somewhere, this place, this grand church with its beautiful art, was the place that enabled Protestant Wotton to meet some of his Catholic rivals without being noticed by the Venetian authorities. Wotton's chaplain, William Bedell, also had a lower profile than Wotton, and so he was able to go even further. He regularly met the leading critics of the Pope in Venice, including two theologians called Paolo Sarpi and Fulgenzio Mercanzio. Here's a picture of Sarpi, who became well known across Europe in his lifetime for writing and circulating pamphlets which criticised the Pope. Another example of printed polemics reaching a broad European audience. Bedell would visit Sarpi and Mercanzio in their monastery under the pretext of teaching them English. In fact, the three men met to discuss Protestant theology, and they worked together to write a series of sermons delivered by Mercanzio in 1609, which were critical of the Pope. They also exchanged printed books and worked on new translations, which they hoped to print and circulate to influence the Venetian political elite. And here we can see on the map, this is one of the quarters of Venice, and we can see the monastery of Santa Maria dei Servi, where Sarpi and Mercanzio were based, and the English ambassador's house. They're just up the canal from each other. Here I've put on the slide a particular account written by Bedell later, after he returned back to England from Venice, and he describes a meeting in a stationer's shop. So one of these shop-based meetings that occurred during his time in Venice, and he discusses how a Catholic in this shop asked a member of the Church of England who was in the shop, probably Bedell himself, though he doesn't say that, what the difference between the two churches was. And Bedell explains how a conversation ensued where he tried to explain the differences between the two religions, and it included getting out one of the books in the shop, which contained the Pope's canon law. And Bedell tried to show that this, the teachings of the canon law were not compatible with what it said in the Bible. So you can see this actually, taking place. These printed works, these shops, this new culture of information, enabling cross-confessional conversation and attempts to convert people of different religions. Some of these activities were known to the Venetian authorities, who wanted to cultivate relations with England and to balance out the Republic's sometimes strained relationship with Rome. But some of Wootton and Bedell's efforts were entirely covert, and the role of the ambassador and the role of what we now call a spy overlapped significantly in early modern Europe. So here's a modern book about Wootton, and as you can see, the subtitle describes Wootton as a spy. And during his time in Venice, Wootton did indeed act as something like a spy in many ways. He intercepted letters from representatives of other states and cultivated a network of informants. But it would nonetheless be misleading to see Wootton or his network of informants as professional spies in the way they are thought of today. In Wootton's Venice, in some sense, everyone was a spy. Information was valuable and anyone could gather and trade in it. Like the world we live in today, well, at least the world we lived in until the pandemic, Venice was characterised by a flow of people and traded goods. And with these people came new ideas. And the development of the printing press had made it easier to spread these ideas, as we have seen. And this whole culture of information meant that everything became much more accessible to a wider range of people. There's a democratization in some sense, in the sense we have seen ourselves with social media in modern times. Short news sheets called avvisi were printed and distributed. And in Venice, people would gather to exchange the latest news just on the street. Here we have another painting by Carpaccio. And here you can see the back left, a little gathering, a little group talking on the just in the street there by the canal or by the sea. And these groups even had a little name. They became known as bozzoli, which translates as clumps or lumps of people. And they were named because it was known that these little groups were so common. People would gather to discuss the news. It would be something that would happen if you walked up the street in Venice every day. You'd see these groups as people passed on information, and then they perhaps would go off to the station shop to spread it on to more people. So this really was something that a wide range, a good cross-section of society could participate in. It was written, but it was also oral. So while you might have, while a large proportion of the population was still illiterate, the literate population would spread on the news they found in their news sheets to the illiterate population, and you'd see a large number of people being able to take part. So anyone who wanted to make a living in Venice knew that you could also make a living as an informant, and ambassadors like Henry Wotton were willing to pay for the information that they received. So this opened up a new source of income to a wide range of people, including people of lower social class and including women as well, who could sometimes get a hold of information that was not accessible to men. So overall, the advent of the printing press and a broader culture of news allowed information to be spread much more quickly. And the culture of news became so well known in Venice that by 1612, we can already see it being parodied by a writer called Bocelliini, who is based in Venice. So in 1612, Bocelliini published a work called I Ragguagli di Parnasso, which translates as here we see in the the English translation that's also made in the 17th century, because the English was so interested. It's translated here as advertisements from Parnassus. But we could also translate it as the news from Parnassus, news sheets from Parnassus. And the text is written as a set of fictional news reports from Parnassus, which is the fictional court of the Roman god Apollo, which Boccellini populates with a whole range of real and mythical figures from the past and present. One report, for instance, sees an eminent cast of 15th and 16th century Italian humanists have a debate about the best features of the Venetian constitution. And in other vignettes, we witness the meeting of the Roman historian Cornelius Tacitus and the 16th century Catholic philosopher Justus Lipsius, who was said to have taken his own political ideas from the works of Tacitus. So it's this sort of mythical setting up, fictional setting up of eminent historical figures, and imagining what would happen in the event of them. In the case of the meeting of Tacitus and Lipsius, the two men don't get on quite as well as readers might have expected from reading their works. In some ways, they're competing to pass on the same political wisdom to their readers. So Boccellini's work is not fake news in the sense of untruth or manipulation, but it is fictional news, playing with the possibilities of news, and showing that that these reports of news, when we start talking, when we start reporting events, there are several levels of truth, as many layers, and it can be interpreted in different ways depending on who does the reporting. So that's been a bit of an overview of the culture in Venice. I thought I'd now look at a few particular examples of some of the misinformation, leaks and skullduggery that were allowed when texts that were printed became the main source of news. So there were various examples of this. You could see, text printed under false names, printed with false imprints, which means when the place of publication on the frontispiece of a book. These are frontispieces that we see now, the front page. You could disguise where these books were printed by giving them a false place of publication. You could also attribute works to your enemies to discredit them. You could release secrets of states to damage rulers, and falsely report crimes or massacres, again to harm your enemies. So to look at some particular examples of these books, I thought we'd first turn to this work. So this is an Italian edition of an Italian language edition of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. So you might have heard of this work. Machiavelli's The Prince, it's often associated with immorality in politics. We often get politicians described as Machiavellian because they're seen as following the teachings of Machiavelli in this book. Because in this book, Machiavelli talks about how, to be a good politician, you need to think about the ends. How the ends sometimes justify the means. So sometimes you will have to torture someone because it's necessary for the protection of the state. So this book, when Machiavelli first wrote it, was very controversial, and it created significant backlash in various quarters amongst people who thought it was unchristian and would be damaging to politics. And it was therefore heavily censored, and people tried to avoid it from reaching a wide circulation, though it did circulate in manuscript as well. Nonetheless, there was demand for a printed edition. So this book, it claims to have been printed on its frontispiece. Here at the bottom of the frontispiece, you can see in Palermo, and it also claims in Sicily, and it also claims to have been published by the heirs of someone called Antoniello degli Antonielli, and so that claim there, it places it as an Italian work. However, in fact, this book was not printed in Italy at all. It was printed in London by a man called John Wolfe, who was a printer who specialised in bringing Italian works to an English readership. So why has Woolf put this false imprint on the front? Why has he claimed it's printed somewhere that it's not by someone who didn't actually print it? Well, this is because it was such a controversial work, and there was still significant control of the press in London. You had to have a license to publish printed works. However, if a work had been printed abroad, then that meant there was more freedom to just sell it on. So that was why Woolf wanted to print this book as if it was printed in Italy, when in fact it was printed in London, to get around censorship, and essentially for commercial reasons, because there was a good market for it. And here's another book with a bit of a misleading frontispiece. So here we have Paolo Sarpi, who we've already met. So Sarpi, the great anti-papal writer in Venice, he wrote a history of the Council of Trent, which was the great Catholic council of the 16th century that tried to undermine the work of the Reformation, to turn back the clock and to have Catholic reform. So here we have Sarpi publishing this book, which revealed, as he saw it, the imposture of this council, how it was manipulated to ensure that legitimate concerns raised by people who were critical of the papacy were suppressed. So the outcome of the council, in fact, just reinforced the Pope's power rather than legitimising any real reforms. This is a very critical history of the Council of Trent. Sarpi couldn't publish this under his own name in Italy because it would have been heavily censored by the papacy and would have led to even more attempts to suppress his work by the papacy. And Sarpi already faced a lot of suppression of his work. He was subject to an assassination attempt, possibly as a consequence of activities by the Pope wanting to get him out the way. So there was good reason why Sarpi didn't want to publish this under his own name in Italy. So he sent the work to London secretly so it could be published there. And when it was published there, it was published in English, Latin and Italian, so that it would reach a really wide readership across Europe, but it was not published in Sarpi's name. Here we see it says written in Italian by Pietro Soavi Polano. So it's a false name, in an attempt to keep Sarpi somewhat more secure. Although actually in this case it didn't really work. It's not a very subtle way of describing his name, as readers across Europe quickly realised. It is in fact pretty much an anagram of Sarpi's name. So it's not a very subtle attempt to hide it, but it did give Sarpi some level of deniability, which then would allow him to have more security as he carried on to write other works and to advise the Venetian Senate. And finally, I was going to talk about this interesting little piece, which also comes out of the activities of the English in Venice. So this is a print which shows the Pope, Pope Paul V, in the middle, and it says underneath him, Paolo V, Paul V, Vici Deo, Vice God. So this was a piece which supposedly was first published in Rome, and which was then seen by William Bedell, the chaplain to the English ambassador in Venice. And when Bedell saw this, he was shocked. He thought this was the ultimate proof of the pride of the papacy, saying that he was a vice god. And that showed the immorality and the fact the Pope was essentially the Antichrist, the ultimate contrast to everything that Christ had stood for. So this text, this print, which supposedly was printed first of all to glorify the Pope, Bedell sends on to various people in London and France who are sympathetic to the Protestant cause, and a French Protestant reprinted it in his own book. And this print we have here comes from the French book, and we can see some French at the top of the screen. If I don't let the anyway, when the little information moves, you can hopefully see that. So this was a French Protestant republishing this as proof that the papacy was so arrogant and wanted to claim all power in Christendom for itself. Now we actually only have now this print surviving. I only know of it existing in its French edition, and it's possible it was actually just a fake to start off with. Possibly the Pope never actually, a Catholic never actually printed this, and if a Catholic did print this, it seems clear that they tried very hard in Rome to suppress it as soon as possible, realizing the damage it could do. But it was too late. It had gotten out, and it was sent abroad, and it was particularly highlighted in various works of Protestant polemic, highlighting the fact that the Pope had put the crowns of rulers stuck to the side of these columns that you see here, showing his pride and how he wanted to undermine temporal rulers. And also the other thing that was highlighted about it, another little bit of strange trivia and playing around with letters, which William Bedell spotted. He wrote home explaining that this was the proof that the Pope was the Antichrist, because he realized in a slightly obscure sort of game of language that if you took out all of the letters from this phrase Paulo Vici Deo, Paul V, vice God, and added up the letters that were also Roman numerals, you reached, guess what, 666, the number of the devil. So here we see something that was originally perhaps intended to glorify the Pope being turned into the absolute proof of the opposite. And it's a text being reused for a very different purpose, or perhaps just being faked in the first place. So obviously at the same time as people were sort of manipulating text, they were also putting out text which promoted a particular image of them. And in this period, we also see the development of particular propaganda efforts. And Sarpi's text was published by the King's printer. The History of the Council of Trent was published by the King's printer, the King James in England, who in fact published a range of texts, including the Bible. So it wasn't all about undermining sources of authority. We also get examples in the early 17th century of people increasingly using propaganda to promote their own authority. So it's really the mixed legacy of the press. There's a really wide variety of things that come out of it, and people have to adapt to these new circumstances, just as we're adapting today. So as a final thought, I thought I'd show you this, this quote from Francis Bacon, who was an English writer and politician. He wrote in a work in 1620 that printing, gunpowder, and the nautical compass had altered the face and state of the world. He highlighted these three changes as these three innovations as particularly significant, having changed the world most in his own time. So to finish, I leave you with the question, what are the three great inventions that have changed the world the most in the last century? My talk today has made a pitch for the internet, making a really big difference. Obviously, recent events have made us think that maybe medical things, it's the discovery of penicillin. So that's something I leave you to think about. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Thanks so much for that, Eloise. So in terms of questions, I think we've had a few come in while you were talking. So if we just go through those first and then tackle some of the ones coming in now. So the first question is literally someone just asking if there's any extra resources or information that they can access, I guess, online to find out more about this topic.
Yes. Yes, that's a good question. So I've obviously put my further reading on the screen. I'll stop sharing the screen in the middle, but I'll leave that for now. But online is a good question. Let's see. I think that there has been there was an interesting project run by Oxford a few years ago, looking at the development of the printing press. I might need to look up what that project was called, but I think that has a website and has tried to put some things online. I think that also there are various I suppose there are some talks by some of these authors available online, I think. So if you Google the names Filippo De Vivo and Nadine Ackerman and Joanna Iordanu, you might be able to find more information there. So yeah, but I have a think about that, and possibly I don't know if I can pass on any other information later to the people who've signed up for the talk. But
Yeah, no, we can do that,
that's
and we
a
can
good start.
we can put something in the chats later as well. I'm guessing these guys might have papers and things that people can access online.
Yes,
Well.
yeah, I think that's right. Exactly. There are various articles which are available online. Should I stop my screen sharing now, or
if you want to leave it up so that people can
right.
look at the names and stuff, I think that's a good shout. So the next question is, I think this must have been sort of in the context of when you were talking. Did they? They did this to convert Christians from Catholic to Protestant. But that's a question. My emphasis is just word.
Yes, exactly. That's something that they were trying to do. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting. I suppose in some ways what they're trying to do really, and if you want a sort of slightly more complex view, or in some ways at the time everyone thinks that they're trying to reunite the church, and they're trying to persuade the others that they're wrong, and to admit that really everyone should be a Catholic or everyone should be a Protestant. So in the long view, this is still a period where people want there to be a united Christendom, and they're hoping that the Reformation won't be a permanent division. But the trouble is, of course, they can't agree on what that united what that united Christianity looks like. So partly they're sort of fighting it out amongst, between Catholics and Protestants, and also lots of other little groups that are emerging that have their own vision of what Christianity is. But yeah, it's a lot about religious conversion.
What sort of impact did the news culture in Venice have on the political culture, and did it help create more of a democracy?
That's a very interesting question. So Venice is unusual at this time because Venice is a republic, so it's not a monarchy, but it's ruled by a senate, and it has an overarching figure, the Doge or Duke, who is elected for life. But they have actually quite limited powers. The Doge doesn't have a lot of power. It's mostly the senators who have a lot of power. So the Venetians, you might think that this would lead to a more open political culture, but in fact, the Venetians are renowned for secrecy. And that little vignette I talked about in the Bocelliini book, where they debate what's the best thing about the government of Venice, they say what's actually the best thing. They decide that the best thing is its secrecy, that it manages to keep its state secrets close to its chest rather than letting them out. But at this time, we do see increasing leaks of the secrets, so it sort of stops working. And Filippo De Vivo, whose work is up on the slide now, he has done some very interesting work. He's highlighted how Sarpi is very unusual because he pushes the Senate to say, look, we need to make our case publicly in this dispute with the papacy, rather than just trying to shut down all discussion of it. So that marks a sort of a new phase where people do discuss, and where there's more of an attempt to shape the popular conversation. So I think it sort of leads to a bit of a democratization de facto, but that's very much not what the Senate, which is an aristocracy rather than a democracy, wants to happen. But it does essentially mean that more people have access to political power and influence.
Do you think the truth? Sorry, do you think? I think this is that truth. Do you think that truth has become politicized in the 21st century, or is this a characteristic seen throughout history?
Yeah, another very interesting question. Yeah, obviously we've seen a lot of discussion of that post-truth. And of course, recently, everyone sharing their truth, this sort of thing. We certainly, I think, truth has become politicized recently. But I think we can worry about this too much. I think, especially when the first discussion of post-truth came out, there's been this assumption that that we're entering a post-truth society, that we haven't had before. But I think, as you've probably seen a bit, the case I've been making today is that. In some sense, the truth has never. We've always known that there's complexity. Different people's ideas of the truth. People will always differ in what they think the truth is, and in some sense, I wonder if what we see in this early modern period is a similar worry, but it's also people embracing that and realizing that there are going to be very different views from very different confessions, and sort of reacting to that accordingly, sort of having quite a I guess having a realistic expectation that these visions of the truth will clash and they're going to have to battle it out, and there probably can't be a sort of independent arbitration on all matters. So I think we obviously do need to hold to the truth when it can be established, but also recognize that sometimes things are more complicated. Once truth stops being about pure fact and becomes interpretation, there will be multiple levels, and that's not the end of the world. It's just a matter of trying to find common ground.
So this is, in a sense, a follow-up to that. Can we learn anything from the way they handled fake news back then to guide how we handle fake news now?
Yeah, again, this is the $1 million question I'd like to be able to answer much better. But I think I think we can, and I think it's having it's recognizing the complexity. I think something like Bocelliini, we see someone playing with the ideas of truth and what the truth means in quite a sort of self-aware way, but nonetheless holding on to the idea that there really is manipulation, and that we need to be aware that politics is characterized by manipulation. So I suppose I think that what we can learn is that there can be a danger of being too sanctimonious, perhaps, and writing people off who are already writing things off because they haven't been. I think in some ways we can do more damage politically by saying, oh, these people are all liars. You need to actually take people seriously, work out where they're coming from, and work out where they think that why they think that they're justified in claiming something as the truth, and that in some sense sort of battling it out as a battle between genuine recognizing there are genuine differences of opinion that we should tackle. But anyway, that's all of it a bit incoherent, I realize, and doesn't entirely doesn't solve everything. But I think that's what we can learn. I think in some sense we can see though we can perhaps be more honest about there always being manipulation, which is something that you see in this phase where Machiavelli and Tacitus are teaching people to think more in depth about the fact that politics is characterized by secrecy and manipulation.
Cool. This one is, was there a case of early modern misinformation that had big political consequences at the time and caused change? If it was, how was it revealed that it was misinformation?
Interesting question. So I suppose it's interesting. I'm struggling to think of what would be the case. I mean, I suppose I've sort of highlighted some smaller scale examples of that. But I think probably in the Venetian context, one of the big worries is news about the Ottomans and when an invading force is coming. And also when protection, or when allies from Europe might be coming. So they end up in these, in these large naval battles in the Adriatic, and you get various instances where, it's reported that the Spanish fleet is on its way, and decisions are made accordingly, and then it transpires the Spanish fleet is not on its way, and in fact the Venetians are defeated. I can't cite a particular case of that, but I think that's a phenomenon we often see in a military context. You see people making decisions based on news reports from elsewhere about how battles are going. And I think there's actually people in the early modern period realize quite quickly that these sort of reports are not very reliable, and they almost always do try and wait until more information has emerges. That's probably another thing we can learn for our own time. And we do, increasingly try to do, but it can easily get carried away. So I think that's something. You get lots of false reports, and people have to sort of check them afterwards. In Venice, Henry Wotton's always hearing the news that King James has been assassinated. That news is always getting there, which and then obviously it turns out to be false. But they have to sort of wait and investigate. But then the King of France, Henry IV, actually is assassinated, and people have to decide quickly about whether they think that's true. But mostly they do end up waiting till information emerges.
This seems quite a tough question. I don't know how you want to sort of read the always in this, but do people always believe the fake news they're sharing, or do they know it's fake?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think lots of people do know it's fake. I guess this is one of the complexities of our own time. You've got, both people who really believe this stuff and don't realize, and people who are on purpose trying to share fake information, and I think you get both instances of both of this in the early modern period too. Perhaps in the examples I've just talked about, where false reports come through or exaggerated reports come through, I think people are definitely aware of that problem, and they know that this information might not be true, but in some sense it's still useful for them to gather it. If you know the rumors, you might be able to get closer to the truth, even if you need to verify them across sources. So I think you could argue that lots of these people, when they're sharing news, they have quite a skeptical attitude to it, and they're trying to find out the truth. Whereas perhaps for us, the bigger worry is that people are sharing things without ever realizing they weren't true. But I also think that applies to early modern people too, especially in the context of religious hostility. People are very willing to believe that, there's been another plot where some Jesuits, the supporters of the papacy, have tried to murder a king, and in fact, it might not be true.
I've just scrolled through some of these because I think we're not going to have time to answer all of them. But this looks like an interesting question. Seeing that the rise of historical fake news coincided with the printing revolution and the continuous use of trading routes / ports, do you think that historical fake news had a greater influence on society than modern fake news does today?
That's very interesting. I haven't really thought about that. Let's see. So I guess I think that it's hard to say at this stage. We're probably struggling to see yet how big a change the internet makes with this regard and the fake news, because I guess with the historical case, with the printing press, it is very clear to us now how much this does change communications, and it is about speed, and it goes along with increasingly fast travel across seas, etc. So I think it's true that could have perhaps more of an effect. It perhaps lets people physically have books for the have new information in books for the first time in some ways. It lets them keep these books for longer. It hasn't got the sort of here today, gone tomorrow character of the internet news. So I think it is, but I think we're only just beginning to see how it affects people today to have the news in their pocket at the touch of a button. And I think it'll be interesting in the next few years to see how that works out. We definitely start to see more polarization. It'll be interesting to see whether people actually do sort of continue to be fooled by this polarization, to be fooled by an internet echo chamber, or whether it actually doesn't end up such a big change because people are still, especially once people are able to meet more in real life again, maybe it will make less of a difference because human interactions between real people still actually come back and put things back to how they were. But it's obviously always hard to make historical comparisons in this regard. It's clear that the printing press was an enormous difference, and I think it's clear that we're also finding enormous differences in society since the introduction of the internet.
Sort of question about the course now. How much of the HSPS course would you say is based on history, and would you say that the course is a comparison between historical and modern times?
So I would say it's not very heavily based on history. You can do, so I do the history of, so my area is the history of political thought. So you can work specifically on the history of political thought, and there's a lot of papers you can do if you want to study the history of political thought, especially if you're doing but you can also do it in the modern day if you want. Of course, when you're analysing politics, modern politics, you'll still be looking at historical examples, but the emphasis will be much more on current politics. So there's a lot of scope for choice. So if you hate history, don't be put off. But if you love it, you can pick a particular path through it. But I must admit that I am probably not the best person to answer this question, because I now work on the history of political thought, which is also in the politics faculty, but I did a history degree to start off with. So you should probably check with someone who's, what has done their degree in this all the way through, when you have the student Q&A later on, I think.
So would studying a language make this topic easier? And then is it particularly European?
Well, I think yes, studying a language is always good, and clearly for the history of Venice, for me, I need to studying Italian is essential for me, as I'm writing a PhD on the history of Venice, essentially. I don't think you don't need to have a language to do HSPS, and I think in terms of doing languages at school, I regret not having done more languages at school, but I didn't take any language beyond GCSE, and I've only learnt Italian and learnt more Latin, which I did for GCSE, but then restarted later on in order to do my historical work. So I would say on languages, I think they're great. They open up whole new worlds. It's a really important thing to do, and not enough people get to do them. But it's also never too late, so you don't need to worry if you've given them up. I think for early modern history, the one I'd really sell as the most important language is Latin, but that's unfortunately not actually so practical. But a fantastic language if you get a chance to do it. It's a wonderful thing to do.
Do you think this culture of news empowered women to an extent, as they were able to create a source of income from the spread of information?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. This book on the screen, Nadine Ackerman's book on invisible agents, which is looking at women as spies in 17th century Britain, that's a really good place to go for information on that. But it's only in recent years that people like Ackerman have started noting how significant women were in this culture of information. They could be informants in a way that men couldn't, and they often were not suspected, but they could do it. People were often aware that they could ask women for information, but didn't think of women they were themselves in contact with as likely to be spies. So I think to some extent it does empower women. Obviously, as usual with women in the early modern period, there's a sort of often women who have a political role have there's something exceptional. It's still the exception, not the norm. And so it empowers certain classes of women. And in Venice, you get a lot of well-educated women who are aristocratic women who end up as nuns or wives of aristocrats. You also have the large courtesan culture of women who essentially have very close relationships with the political elite, and who they can be very useful if you want to find out something that shouldn't be known about the way politics is going. So I think that it's definitely clear that in Venice, where this culture of information is a one of its is in one of its sort of most widespread forms, or it's most widespread through the population, women are more likely to be well known as musicians or writers, or as for their education and political importance than elsewhere in Europe at this time.
How did a mediator of information gain their status as reliable? And there's a follow-up question asking, how did people know which information was true and which was a lie?
Yes, well, this was the great question for Henry Wotton and others. Well, I think often that was the problem. People did turn out not to be reliable. That one of the things was just to try and pay people as much as possible, because in some ways your best informant was the one who was just willing to go to the highest bidder if you knew you could be the highest bidder. So that was one way people did it. paid lots. But obviously the trouble with that is there often is a highest bidder. So I think people, that there's definite effort. You can see in the letters from this time, people making assessments of how discreet people are, how strongly held their views are. Can they sort of defend these views? Are they genuine? Do they genuinely seem to be convinced of Protestant arguments, or are they just saying it because they think they're going to get some money? That's the type of considerations that someone like Wootton needs to look at. But it's very difficult. And in fact, the English embassy in Venice, they think they send back various people to England as converts, who say they want to, Italians who say they've become Protestants and want to go back to England, and that they'll write anti-papal propaganda, that they want to leave the Church of Rome. But actually, there's at least 3 of these people in high-profile cases reconvert back again, even though they've sort of been through a lot of questioning to try and find out more about them. So I think it's even when people think they've done all the checks they can, people can be unreliable. And some people make a life as double agents. They just want to, play it both ways, spread a bit of information, and gain the maximum amount of money, keeping everyone's trust. So I think in terms of how people know what's true or not, they don't. And they have to keep trying to make assessments and to gather information from multiple sources, and to spot when the leaks come out who it might have been. And that's very difficult to do, and it often leads to mishaps. In fact, the efforts of the English to get things printed in Venice, that all falls apart when a letter is lost and passed on to, and ends up being passed to the Senate and revealing various activities. So unfortunately, it's very difficult, and they all know it's difficult. So it's a matter of trying to be as safe as possible, destroying letters when you receive them, that kind of thing.
Right. We'll take one more question. I think we've got to move on to the student Q&A. So what encouraged you to research Venice over any other city when exploring the topic of early fake news?
Interesting question. So I suppose I was taken by Venice because I was just taken by the Italian civic life in general. I thought it was really fascinating that in Italy you get lots of these smaller city-states that have politics that isn't just monarchical, like most of Europe at the time. So that was sort of my personal interest, which led me to Venice. But Venice is the place to go for this period, and for the news, partly because it has because of this trading status, because it's uniquely well connected, and people see it as this center for new ideas across Europe. And to some extent, actually, the trading glory is fading with the discovery of the Americas. But Venice is still this sort of this cosmopolitan place where people come from different backgrounds, people can gather, people can mingle. So I think that's what's so fascinating about it. It's just idiosyncratic in many ways. It's idiosyncratic because it's not a monarchy. It's idiosyncratic because it's Catholic but somewhat skeptical of the papacy, and so on and so forth. So I think that's why Venice is so interesting. And of course, it's great because you can visit it today, and it still looks so much like the 17th century, which is wonderful.